Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to guide you step by step one way of making a masterboard, and then I'm going to take that masterboard and turn it into multiple projects, including some keychains and some cards. So let's get started. Now, a masterboard is like a collage paper that you use for multiple projects, and there's lots of ways of doing a masterboard. This is just one way. You can take the same steps, mix them up, and you're going to end up with a slightly different look. So what I grabbed here, because I want to use up my gel prints, are just some gel prints, and they have something in common. So basically my colors are bright aqua, that's that aqua color there, and magenta. And then I have some gel prints that have those colors together. And I am just doing the rip a strip technique. That's what I call it. I'm just ripping the gel prints into some random shapes and layering them up on my 11 by 17 copy paper. That's just plain copy paper underneath. Because I know I'm going to be using this as a background and I don't want the paper to get too thick. So once I have a rough idea of where I want the collage papers, the gel prints to go, I grab my fluid matte medium. You can use gel medium if that's what you have, and I'm gluing it down. I want to make sure I get good adhesion here. The paper gets very wet, so you're going to need to allow some dry time in there. This is really relaxing, and you're not having to think too hard. Now the colors that I've chosen here jumpstart my color story. I'm going to basically stick to the quinacridone magenta and the bright aqua. And then I'm going to add black and white contrasting. But I'm not going to deviate too far from that. Now the papers that I'm using, this one is on deli paper. You could have some that are on tissue paper. Your collage papers could be napkins. Every paper collages down a little bit differently and adds to the overall effect. Now, some of this, especially the details, you're not going to see at the end, but like I said, it starts your color story, and it's also adding a lot of texture to it when you layer it up. Speaking of texture, step 2, I am going to put modeling paste through a stencil, and I've chosen this Stamperia one. I got some new stamps and stencils, all from Stamperia. They're from the same collection, and I haven't had an opportunity to use them because I've been busy doing Christmas stuff, and they're kind of more sea, ocean themed. But I thought now would be a good time. So even if this one is kind of like net, like from the ocean, on here it's very neutral, which is why I bought it. It's a good neutral one. I'm taking thick gesso and putting it through the stencil with a key card. Now I'm using thick gesso instead of modeling paste because I don't want the extra bulk that modeling paste would give, and it's a little bit thicker. The thick gesso also dries faster, and I'm an impatient creator. So I'm loving the patterning that that's giving. Now every layer that I'm doing now, you may or may not see later on to different degrees. Now I'm going to add some stamping. We are going to go back and forth, and we're going to add lots of layers of marks, visual texture, physical texture. So in order to stamp with these stamps, I am taking some black acrylic paint and I'm going to brayer it onto the stamp. I find this is a really good way of getting a nice even layer when you are using your stamps with acrylic paint. And I prefer using acrylic paint to it. It adds a little bit more texture than just ink, and if you absolutely think you made a mistake, you can wipe it off with a baby wipe typically, which ink you really can't. Now again, these are just points of interest in the background. When you are doing a masterboard, because you're not focused on the composition, because you don't know what parts you're going to use, and you're free to just explore. you're not limited. So often the Masterboard, you create something that you wouldn't create if you were just doing a background on an art journal page, because I think that you're just more free when you're doing a Masterboard. Here I'm using a DIY stamp and mark makers to add more pattern to this Masterboard. So Masterboards, you use them for multiple projects. So you do the work once, you do the cleanup once, and then you have multiple uses. And it also frees you up creatively. Sorry. And since I don't know if I'm going to go landscape or horizontal, vertical, I don't know how that's going to go. I'm putting the stamping going in different directions. Now step 4, I think, is an important one. I'm applying gesso. This softens the edges, blends those ripistrips that you put down a little bit, smooths it out. It kind of makes it all come together. Now I said the steps that I followed in making this Masterboard, I could do the exact same things in a different order. And so can you. And you'll get a slightly different effect. So I could have just collaged the papers down and then did the gesso. And play with that, because there is no absolute right or wrong way of making a Masterboard. Now step 5, I'm just adding paint, and I am basically sticking to the quinacridone magenta and the bright aqua. And then I mix them, and when you mix those two colors, you get this beautiful purple tone. So that, the purple, the magenta, the aqua, as well as the black and white, are going to be my color story for this. Now inevitably, I always seem to lose a lot of the white space on my Masterboards. I go a little too far, I put a little too much color on. That's me. If you like the white space, you can stop. Now a Masterboard, you can take it right to completion and use it as it is, as kind of an Insta background on your projects. And that's what I've done here on the projects that are coming up. I don't change anything about the Masterboard, but you could. I could take it to, if I had stopped here and then I decided, okay, I'm going to do 5 different projects. Each project I could add different things to at that stage. So it's just a jump start to your process, not a finished background. Does that make sense? So there you can see the beautiful purples that come in. You can take a baby wipe and wipe it back. I'm loving the soft, muted colors. Now step 6, I'm going to add more marks. I'm going to use stencil. And this stencil is called Fantangle. I love that fan motif. And I love adding the white here. It's going to brighten my background or my Masterboard. And again, I'm not stuck on here's my page because I don't know what I'm going to do here. So I'm just focusing on what looks good. Very intuitive. You'll have noticed every time I add another layer, it pushes back what's behind it. But every little bit of that is showing through. And there's lots of texture because I've layered up collage papers and I've added thick gesso through the stencil. You can add different stencils at different parts of the Masterboard. And step 7, I'm going to do even more stamping. And dots are always a good idea. This stamp I've used and used and used. It's a good basic one. It was actually on a block. I cut it off. This is only half of it. I'm putting on white acrylic paint. But I could have done aqua here. I could have done black. Everything would be giving a slightly different effect. People often ask what paints I use. Most of my paints are Liquitex Basics. They're just a student grade, medium bodied acrylic paint. So I'm loving the way this Masterboard has come together, the soft muted colors, but I'm not quite done. Here I'm adding some script stamp, and I'm putting black acrylic paint on and stamping with it because I love having script in the background. I think if I was doing this again, I might have done the script stamp before the stenciling so that it would have been pushed back a little bit more, because some of that black was a little too visual, too seen. So there is the finished Masterboard. Now, when you're using a Masterboard, you don't have to make all the pieces at once like I'm going to be doing. You could just have this in your stash and cut what you need when you need it to make one project at a time. So the first thing we're going to do is just decide what projects you're going to use. So again, if you just want to do this on a background of a 7x10 art journal page, which is what I'm doing here, you could just cut out that piece, the rest goes back in your stash. You don't have to decide on how you're going to use the entire Masterboard. And here I'm going to use this as backgrounds for a 6x6 card, and then I'm also going to cut one for a 5x7 card. So for the 6x6, I cut out a 5x5 square, and the 5x7, basically I've taken off an inch of it as well. And here I'm using my template, my window template, to decide what part of the Masterboard I want to use, because some parts are more interesting than others or more suited. So the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to glue down the Masterboard. Now the Masterboard is pretty thick, so I've opted to use gel medium instead of fluid medium. I just find for thicker papers that works best. Here I'm just cutting these to size, and I like having that white border around. But if that's not your thing, you can make it go the full front of the card. Before I glue the Masterboards on the front of the cards, I'm going to edge them with black. It's just a little easier to do now, and I avoid getting that black on that white border. I try hard to keep that white border pristine. But, you know, I'm a messy creator, so it's not exactly pristine at the end. So I'm just eyeballing it, lining it up, using the brayer to press it down, and I'm just making sure that it is completely adhered. Now I could just put these backgrounds on these cards and leave it as it is, put on a sentiment, or just leave it as just abstract art. But I decide to put some Julie Nutting dolls on and a sentiment on that. These are kind of motivational cards. So I go to my stash. I have these Julie Nutting dolls stamped and cut out, ready to go. I've done that in a stash builder. I went to my sentiment pack. This is my Courage sentiment pack that is available as a digital download for purchase from NINNYSNAPKINS.com, and I'll link that in the description box. Just click the more arrow. And all I'm doing is gluing this down. I absolutely love the Insta background that came from that Masterboard on these cards. And if you're an eagle eye, you're going to realize that the final composition of the card that I'm working on right now changes up. I actually glued those things on backwards, so I ended up having to peel them off and redo it. And here's where I've just started redoing it. Sometimes creating is one step forward, two steps back. I have used these Julie Nutting dolls and the Crazy Birds so much on my art journal pages, on cards, on things that I've created. You know, I've gotten a lot of value out of them. And I'm giving it a good coat of the matte medium to seal the paper. Now this this is a 7x10 art journal page, and this is a poinsettia flower, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to turn this into a palm tree. I'm not sure why I decided to do that, but sometimes I look at things that I have in my stash and I change it up and I play mix and match. Now I'm going to be honest here, what I end up with on the art journal page is not my favorite. It didn't come together like I thought it was going to, but it's fun and you experiment, and that's how you learn. Now these are keychains that I picked up at Michael's or the Dollar Tree, I'm not sure. So we're going to use those little bits. So I'm just tracing the round shapes. I've taken off the keychain part of it, using it as a tracer. And I'm going to use up those little bits. Now I did this several years ago. I made a keychain using a Masterboard. And I wasn't sure that it was going to wear very well or the usability of it, but it's lasted and lasted. So I think this is a great way of using up those little bits and creating something that's a nice little gift. You can add it as a gift tag to a gift for a friend. So here I've decided, you know, I'm going to mark where the hole is. And I'm going to use the punch to punch that hole before I glue it down. So if you're doing something like that, this is the kind of thing I recommend. It worked so well. So again, here's something I learned as I went. Instead of cutting it with scissors and not getting it exact, what I decided to do was just glue it on without cutting. You don't need to cut it out. Let it dry, and then use an X-Acto knife, cutting along that straight edge. Without, you need to avoid cutting into the wood. but this worked so much better. And on this, you really want to make sure that you get a perfect adhesion. So I'm putting it on both sides, lining up where the hole punch is, and cutting off the excess. And then I'm letting it dry, coming back and checking to make sure I've sealed all those edges. We are going to come back to finishing up those cards and that art journal page. When you're doing multiple makes, you can set things aside and give them time to dry. Now those little bits I'm using my punches, and I'm just cutting out some circles from whatever's left over. This is just going into my stash, and it's going to find its way onto an ATC or an art journal page at some point in time. Don't throw anything out. So as I said, the sentiments on the art journal page and the cards comes from my Courage sentiment pack. And I was toying with the idea of leaving everything white. I have a beautiful colored background. I was just going to shade this white and leave it alone. But then I just decided I'm going to change that. I'm going to colorize these things. Even though this page isn't my favorite, I do love these crazy birds. Now, from my short and sweet sentiment pack, I'm just going to add some phrases to both sides of these keychains. It's kind of a motivational thing. Seek balance, dream on. So you can do this up, send a wish to your friend when you gift this to them. I'm using my Secura Jelly Roll glaze pen and just outlining them. And then using the fine line applicator bottle to do some faux stitching around the edge. I've also shaded around the end with black, and the edge is black. That helps the white faux stitching stand out a little bit more. So keep your eye open at Michael's, at the dollar store for these kind of little keychains. Great way to use up Masterboard pieces or gel prints. So once this is completely dry, I'm going to give it at least 2 coats of this polyacrylic varnish. You could use sparkling glitter glaze if you want to add something to it. You can get your own version from DecoArt. So let's finish up these cards. Now I toyed with the idea of leaving them white, as I said, but then I decided I'm going to colorize them. So here I just buy a craft paint that is a flesh tone that I like using, and I can use that. I don't have to mix paint, I don't have to do anything, and it's easy for me to colorize. So I'm just applying first the base coat of color. I am going to come back and I'm going to do some shading. Now I chose to do the aqua dress for her because there's not much aqua. There's just a hint of it in that particular part of the Masterboard. And this one, I decide I'm going to use the magenta. Or do I? Actually end up putting the aqua on and going with that purple. I didn't like how the pink looked. Judgment call. But again, I'm keeping with the color story that I started in the Masterboard. So here I'm adding the aqua and it's turning everything purple. Magic. Painted the hair yellow oxide. So when I'm doing multiple makes, I tend to do an assembly line where I do all the shading, all the coloring, all the gluing. Now I'm shading around the sentiments here. And then I'm going to shade the girls themselves. The dresses, the hair. And I'm using my angle brush and black acrylic paint. Although on the flesh color or the skin, I do use brown. I swatch, the black is a little too stark. I'm using my Posca pen to outline the sentiment here. And then I decide I'm going to outline this one. Didn't really need it since I shaded around it, but... And then I'm splattering with gold, just to add a little bit of bling. I absolutely love the cards. So I like the yellow on the hair of the girls. So I decided I'm going to paint this Crazy Bird yellow. It's yellow oxide, and that's an Artist Loft brand. But I've used yellow oxide in the Liquitex brand as well. It's kind of what's available, when it's available, what's the best price. I like putting the birds in the middle of plants. And then I'm shading around the petals of this flower turned palm tree. So the finishing, no matter what, if it's a card or an art journal page, all those finishing steps, the shading, the splattering, the faux stitching, that's all very similar. So here I decided I like the faux stitching on the keychain, so I decided to add it to the cards, which I think worked perfectly. And there are the finished projects. Again, not my favorite, but you know what? It was fun, and I tried something out. Maybe I'll try it again with different results. Well, time will tell. I absolutely love these cards, and I think next time I'm just going to make card backgrounds with my next Masterboard. They give such interest. A Masterboard makes for such interesting backgrounds. And these keychains, I absolutely love them. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you go and make a Masterboard and create different things from it. Until next time, go get creative.